Hi everyone, this is Dr. Lasky again. The topic of today's video will be a general structure for Chapter 4, and what we'll do is I will walk you through the Word document that I've prepared for this session, and I will first cover general structural rules, and then we'll go through examples. So Chapter 4 is it's your findings chapter. This is where you discuss the results of your data analysis. And the very first thing you do is you provide a general introductory paragraph for the chapter. And when you present your findings, you first introduce the data, you present the data, and then you analyze and interpret the data. There are many different ways that you can present and display your data, and we will cover those after we go through the general introduction. With every piece of data that you present, that you share in your chapter 4, you need to repeat this structure. So if you have 3 tables with 3 different pieces of data in it, you will first introduce the data, you will present the data in the table, then you'll analyze and interpret the data for your reader. Okay? When you present quantitative data, means and standard deviation is the most common format used in published research. I know it's not quite the same as what Mertler says. Median is not necessarily the best way to display your data, particularly if you understand what standard deviation means. For the purposes of class, if you don't know how to calculate a mean and standard deviation in a program like Excel, percent per response category is fine. So what I've done up below here is a sample table which shows you one way that you can set up a percent per response table. So in the table below, we're looking at ice cream flavors people most love. You'll see that over here on the far left are the questions. Here are your response categories: degree, disagree to strongly disagree, and it's in percent. Neutral, I'm neutral about it, agree to strongly agree, and then the percent. So when we look at this breakout of the data, what we see is that 25% of our respondents disagree to strongly disagree that they love strawberry ice cream. 25% of our respondents are neutral. They don't have a preference one way or the other to the question or the statement, I love strawberry ice cream, while 50% agree to strongly agree that they love strawberry ice cream. And I want you to notice in the way that I talked you through the presentation, you need to present your data as the question itself is worded. So if you ask the question, I love chocolate chip crunch ice cream, and you have 10% who disagree or strongly disagree, you need to write it up just exactly as that. 10% of my respondents or my participants disagree or strongly disagree with the statement, I love chocolate chip crunch ice cream. I didn't realize how hard that was going to be to say when I wrote that sentence. 40% of my respondents are neutral. They neither disagree or agree with the statement, while 50% of my participants agree to strongly agree with the statement, I love chocolate chip crunch ice cream. So this is a sample table using percent per response category. Further down towards the very end of the document that we've got here, I'll show you how to do a table with means and standard deviations. One thing that's really important to remember is that visual displays such as bar graphs, line graphs, pie graphs, scatter plots, they're represented as figures, not as tables. And there's again an example of that towards the end of this document. With qualitative data, your participants' comments are your actual data. And in presenting the data, what you'll do is you'll take direct quotes and you inset them in your narrative. With your qualitative data, you can organize by themes or trends, but you can also organize by unique responses. What I'm about to use as the example is a part of a very small section from my dissertation. It was on teacher professional vulnerability in a context of secondary school reform. And what we see here is you have your level 1 heading right here for your chapter 4, and this particular set of findings is focusing on what I termed structural vulnerability. You'll notice that I start the chapter with a general introduction. This is to prepare the reader for what's coming in the narrative that follows. You clearly will not be talking about teacher professional vulnerabilities. Now, the first piece of data that I'm presenting is on the professional and personal impact of secondary school reform on the participants in my study. I start out by introducing the data. Data indicate that reform implementation is having a considerable effect on teacher vulnerability. First discussed are the results of the survey that focus on several dimensions of reform implementation, including professional and personal impact of secondary school reform. And it goes on to say what else will be covered. It goes on, because I ran scales and did factor analysis, I start with an explanation of what's actually coming up in the table. So the scale in table 1, it gives you the alpha coefficient, which tells you the strength of relationship. And I explain that. When we look at table 1, what you'll notice is you have the factor name over here, which is where your question would go. And these were all the items that made up that particular scale. And this is the strength of relationship among these variables. Down here, what you have is you have the interpretation and the analysis of that data, okay? So the aggregated mean for this scale is 2.69 with a standard deviation of 0.52. This indicates that teachers moderately agree with the items in this scale. They moderately agree that secondary school reform is too much too fast. In the current year, their stress level as a result of secondary school reform is running high. So, what I want you to notice is I actually interpreted what that meant for each one of these items in the factor. And it gets a little redundant, but that's okay. That's how you play the game. Next, we go on to discuss workload. And again, 4 items measure how teacher workload is affected. I give you the primary finding, and then I go on and I interpret the finding. So that's the structure. You introduce it, you present the data, and you analyze the data. And down here, you'll see that I've used other research in the field to support the position I'm taking and to add complexity to the interpretation of my data. Now we're going to move on to a presentation of how to structure the presentation of qualitative data. So when we look over here at vulnerability and reform implementation, which is again a level 2 heading, we're going into another piece of data that we're presenting. You have the introduction. Here's the introductory paragraph. Central to teachers' discussions of vulnerability are the conditions of secondary school reform and the implementation under which they are presently teaching. Okay, like the teacher survey data, teacher interview data make it clear that reform implementation is having considerable influence on the ways they experience professional vulnerability. All 4 teachers did, in fact, not initially discuss their professional vulnerability outside of the present school reform context. And this entire piece of data right here is my evidence. This is one teacher's actual words verbatim. Okay. Now, what I get into after the presentation of the data is the analysis. So I'm going to repeat the structure again. Here you have the introduction to the finding. Here you present your evidence. Here is your analysis of the evidence. Now we repeat the structure with the next piece of data. All four teachers describe teaching as a humanistic profession. They express concern for the direction in which they feel the new reform efforts are taking education. And this goes into some of the nuances of their statements. And here again is further introduction. And what you can see right here is the actual quotation mark, and this is teacher words, my statement, teacher words, my question, and here we have more teacher words, me probing for clarification. Here we have more actual teacher data. This is your evidence when you use qualitative research. Now, next we have the interpretation of that data. Okay? So what you can see with both the quantitative and the qualitative data is that you first introduce your data, and if you're doing quantitative, you have to describe it in words. You present the data in your table or in a figure, and then you interpret it for the reader. That's the structure you want to follow with every piece of data you present, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. So here we go into the presentation of the qualitative data. We introduce the finding. I provide my evidence. Right here, this is the teacher talking about that particular dimension of vulnerability. Now, we analyze the data, we interpret it. Here I introduce the next finding, talk about the nuances in the way that they experience vulnerability and the causes of their vulnerability, and then this entire inset piece here, this is all right here, this is your evidence. Okay? And we come down here, and this is your interpretation of that data. That's the basic structure you will follow. The last couple of resources I have here are showing you actually, this one here I got from the internet, and this is drawn from APA 6, okay, so it's recent, it's relevant, and it's what I'd like you to use as a model. Tells you how to set it up, But then what it does here is it actually gives the sample table. Notice on the tables that I've set up for you, there are no vertical lines. And the only place you have horizontal lines are up here to delineate the beginning of the table under your what are essentially the headings for your various columns, and then the one down at the bottom to designate that it's the end. When you set up your tables, you'll see all the lines, but then you can go into your borders and you delete the vertical and the internal horizontal. This is a table that shows how to present your means and your standard deviation. And standard deviation is abbreviated as SD, and the mean is abbreviated as M, and that's the standard in the field. Okay? And in this particular table, they were talking about hours a week in various activities after school. What I'm going to show you next is how you set up a sample figure. It's taken from a chapter I wrote several years ago. Notice what we start with here is an introduction to the table, and in this case, this is actually discussing the role that this particular figure played in a professional development session that we gave with a group of teachers who were from all over the country. And then we give the figure. So notice that unlike with the table, you designate the name of the table the name of the figure and the number of the figure actually underneath the figure. Okay? So the structure you would follow is introducing your figure. If this were a pie graph, you would say in the pie graph below, we will be looking at how frequently people organize for collaborative work, build assessment literacy, and create data overviews. And then you would present the data in your pie chart or your pie graph, and then down here you would interpret it. Okay? So this is about all I've got to say on Chapter 4. If you have further questions, please contact me, guys. I think this will help understand the structure of Chapter 4, and I look forward to reading the drafts that you send me.